three men blocked the back exit of the glass tower, the same hallway where CEO Amelia Carter had just found a betrayal hidden on a dropped flash drive. Her head of security had vanished. Her phone showed no signal. The emergency door behind her had been locked from outside. When the man leading the group smiled and told her there was nowhere left to run, a quiet single father in a worn work jacket stepped out from the shadows behind them. He said only two words: "Wrong door." The hallway went silent, and everyone there understood they had chosen wrong. If you love stories about quiet people who hold real power, stay with this one until the very last moment. Rain fell over Chicago in long gray sheets the night the glass tower at the edge of the financial district stood almost empty. Carter Global occupied the top floors of that tower, and on most evenings the building emptied out by 7, leaving only the hum of climate systems and the distant flicker of city light through tinted windows. Tonight was different. Amelia Carter, 34 years old and already known across the industry for rebuilding a failing logistics company into one of the most respected names in the country, had stayed behind long after her staff went home. A merger worth $800 million sat on her desk, waiting for a signature she was no longer certain she should give. She had read the contract 3 times that week, and each time something about the language felt wrong, as if it had been written by someone who understood her company better than she did. Numbers that should have matched did not. A transfer here, a vendor payment there, all routed through an internal security budget that had quietly tripled over the past 2 quarters. She told herself it was nothing, the kind of paperwork noise that came with running a company this size. But the feeling did not leave her, and it was that feeling more than the contract itself that kept her at her desk long after the rain started. Down on the lower mechanical floor, a man in a faded work jacket moved through the maintenance corridor with the calm patience of someone who had done the same rounds 100 times before. His name was Mason Reed, 36 years old, a maintenance technician who had been with the building for 6 quiet months. He carried a battered toolbox and said little to anyone, which suited him fine. Most of the staff barely noticed him. To the executives who passed him in the elevator, he was simply the man who fixed flickering lights and stuck doors, someone whose presence registered for a moment and then vanished from memory entirely. Amelia had seen him before, brief crossings in the elevator at odd hours, a nod exchanged without conversation. She had never really looked at him the way she might look at a colleague or a stranger worth remembering. He was background the way good infrastructure always is, noticed only when something breaks. She had no reason to think otherwise, and on a night like this with $800 million and her company's future weighing on her shoulders, a maintenance technician was the furthest thing from her mind. Earlier that evening, in a quiet stretch of hallway near the loading dock, Mason had taken a short call on an old phone he kept separate from anything connected to the building's network. His daughter's voice had come through warm and a little tired. He told her gently that he would be home a little later than planned, that dinner could wait, that he loved her and would see her soon. The call lasted under a minute. It was the kind of ordinary exchange that happens in 1,000 homes every night, nothing more, a small thread of a normal life running quietly beneath everything else that was about to happen in that building. Back on the executive floor, Amelia rose from her desk to gather her coat when something on the carpet near the conference table caught her eye, a small object that did not belong there. Dark and rectangular, and easy to miss unless the light caught it just right. She bent down and picked it up. A flash drive, unlabeled, clearly dropped in haste by someone who had not meant to lose it. She turned it over once in her hand, feeling the first cold edge of instinct telling her that this small object was about to change everything she thought she understood about the people working closest to her. Amelia carried the flash drive back to her desk and plugged it into a laptop that was not connected to the company network. An old habit from years of handling sensitive negotiations. The first file that opened was a folder of documents she did not recognize, financial structures dressed up to look like routine vendor agreements but built, on closer reading, to strip her of voting control the moment the merger closed. A second file held a recorded conversation, voices she knew well discussing how to pressure her into signing without reading the fine print too closely. The man speaking with the most confidence was Hunter Blake, her head of security, a man she had trusted enough to hand the keys of her safety to. She reached for her phone and called the security desk, asking why several cameras on floor 38 were showing as offline. Hunter's voice came back smooth and unconcerned, explaining that maintenance had taken them down for routine servicing and that everything would be restored within the hour. It was a reasonable answer, the kind he had given a dozen times before, except tonight it landed differently. Only a small circle of people knew she had planned to stay late, and the timing of a sudden camera outage felt far too convenient to ignore. What Amelia did not yet know was the name behind the larger plan. Connor Vale, a quiet but deeply connected investor who had spent the past year buying small positions in companies that supplied Carter Global, had spent months engineering a slow squeeze on her stock price. A merger gone wrong, a scandal timed perfectly, a board frightened into panic, and control of the company could pass into hands far more willing to bend than hers ever had been. Connor preferred patience over force, manipulation over confrontation, and he had found in Hunter Blake a man whose ambition made him easy to buy. Down on the lower floors, Mason adjusted a panel near the elevator shaft when a stray voice crackled through an old radio frequency he still monitored out of habit, a leftover line from an earlier building contractor that nobody had bothered to decommission. The voice was clipped and tense. "She has seen the file. Get it back before she leaves the floor." Mason did not recognize the speaker, but the urgency in those 5 words told him everything he needed to know about how the rest of this night might unfold. He did not rush toward the executive floor or announce what he had heard. Instead, he moved with the same unhurried pace he always used, quietly pulling up a mental map of every exit, every stairwell, every door that led away from the 40th floor. It was a habit so old it no longer felt like training, simply the way his mind organized a room the moment he entered it. Years ago, that instinct had kept people alive in situations far more dangerous than office politics dressed up as a hostile takeover. Tonight, it told him something on this floor was about to go wrong, and that the woman upstairs likely had no idea how exposed she had become. A junior staff member, the only other person still in the building besides Amelia, happened to walk past Mason near the stairwell and made an offhand remark about the new maintenance worker who somehow knew the building's wiring better than the engineers who had installed it. Mason offered only a polite nod and kept walking, the kind of response designed to end a conversation rather than continue one. He had spent 6 months making himself forgettable on purpose, and he had no intention of breaking that pattern now, even with a clear sense that the quiet life he had built for himself and his daughter was about to be tested. Upstairs, Amelia closed the laptop, slid the flash drive into her coat pocket, and walked toward the back hallway that led to the private exit she used when she wanted to avoid the main lobby. The corridor lights flickered once as she stepped through the door, a small and ordinary glitch in any other week. Tonight, with her pulse already raised and her instincts sharpened by what she had just discovered, the flicker felt like a warning rather than a coincidence, the first sign that the night was no longer following any plan she had made for herself. The back hallway behind the executive floor was rarely used, a narrow stretch of corridor meant for staff rather than guests, lined with service doors and a single emergency exit that opened onto an external stairwell. Amelia had walked it 100 times without a second thought. Tonight, 3 men stood waiting near the far end, positioned in a loose triangle that made the corridor feel suddenly much smaller than it was. She recognized none of them, though their posture told her everything about why they were there. Jason Knox stood closest, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with the relaxed confidence of a man who had done this kind of work before and expected no resistance. Ryan Pierce leaned against the wall near the emergency door, arms crossed, watching her with the bored patience of someone waiting for a formality to finish. Carter Miles stood slightly behind the other 2, quieter, his eyes scanning the corridor rather than focusing on Amelia directly, the posture of someone assigned to watch the edges rather than lead the conversation. Amelia stopped a careful distance away and asked, in a voice that stayed remarkably level, what exactly they thought they were doing in a private corridor of her own building. Jason answered first, his tone almost friendly, explaining that she had something that did not belong to her, something small and rectangular that would be much easier for everyone if she simply handed over now. She told him she had no idea what he meant, buying herself a few seconds while her mind worked through every possible way out of this hallway. Her phone, pulled halfway from her pocket, showed no signal at all, the bars completely gone in a building where she normally had full reception even in the basement. It did not take her long to understand why. A small device tucked near the electrical panel down the hall was quietly jamming every frequency in the area, a detail she would only learn later. For now, all she knew was that she was alone, unreachable, and standing in front of 3 men who clearly had no intention of letting her walk past them toward the emergency door. She tried the door regardless, pressing down on the bar out of simple instinct, and felt the cold confirmation that it had been locked from the outside, the kind of lock that should never have been engaged on a fire exit in the first place. Ryan watched her try it with a faint, unbothered smile, as though her attempt only proved how thoroughly they had already planned this. Amelia drew herself up straighter, falling back on the only weapon she had left in that moment, the steady, unshakable presence of someone who had spent years learning never to let fear show on her face during a negotiation. She told them, with more calm than she actually felt, that whoever had sent them clearly did not understand what they were dealing with, and that there were people who would notice her absence within the hour. Jason laughed softly and stepped closer, telling her that titles and money meant very little in a hallway with no cameras and no witnesses, that out here she was simply a woman standing between him and a piece of hardware he had been paid to retrieve. The corridor seemed to grow colder with every word, the kind of silence that settles before something is about to happen. It was Carter Miles who noticed movement first, a shift near the maintenance door at the far end of the hallway, easy to miss if you were not already watching for it. A man stepped out from the shadows there, unhurried, wearing the same faded work jacket he always wore, carrying nothing more threatening than a battered toolbox in one hand. Jason barely glanced at him, waving him off with the kind of dismissive irritation reserved for hired help who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time, telling him flatly to walk away before he got hurt. Mason did not walk away. He looked past the three men toward the locked exit behind them, studied it for a moment as though reading something written there that only he could see, and then looked back at Jason with an expression that held no anger and no fear, only quiet, settled certainty. "Wrong door," he said simply, the words landing in that narrow hallway with a weight. None of the three men expected from someone they had already decided did not matter. Amelia felt something shift in the air the instant he spoke, a change so small it would have been easy to miss if she had not been standing close enough to feel it. Jason's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, the first crack in a confidence that had carried him this far. She did not yet understand who this man really was, but for the first time since the lights had flickered out in that corridor, she felt something other than fear settle into her chest. It felt strangely like hope. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe. Mason set his toolbox down without any wasted motion, his movements economical in a way that suggested decades of practice rather than improvisation. Jason lunged first, confident that size alone would settle the matter, and found his wrist caught and turned before he understood what was happening. The strap from Mason's tool bag, looping once around his arm and locking it behind his back with a pressure that made resistance pointless. Jason's confident smile dissolved into a grunt of surprise and pain as he dropped to one knee. Ryan moved next, faster than Jason had been but no more effective. Mason simply stepped sideways, his foot catching the edge of a loose floor panel near the emergency door, the same one maintenance had flagged for repair weeks earlier and nobody had gotten around to fixing. Ryan's balance gave out entirely, his feet sliding out from under him as though the floor itself had decided to join the fight on Mason's side. He hit the ground hard enough to knock the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping and momentarily unable to do anything but blink up at the ceiling. Carter Miles, the quietest of the three, reacted with more caution, raising his hands as though preparing for an actual confrontation rather than charging in blind. Mason closed the distance calmly, using nothing more dramatic than the heavy metal flashlight clipped to his belt. A short controlled strike to the shoulder followed by a simple lock that folded Carter's arm behind him and dropped him against the wall. The entire exchange, start to finish, lasted only a handful of seconds. No wasted violence, no unnecessary force, simply the precise application of skill against people who had badly underestimated the man they were dealing with. Amelia stood frozen against the wall throughout, watching with something close to disbelief. The maintenance worker she had barely registered in passing elevator rides had just disarmed 3 trained men without raising his voice once, without a single wasted movement, as though violence of this kind was simply another task on a long and ordinary list of things he knew how to do well. She had built her career reading people quickly, and everything about this scene told her that the man standing in front of her was not who the building directory listed him as. Mason checked each of the 3 men briefly, confirming none of them needed urgent medical attention, then moved straight to the emergency door and the nearby electrical panel without acknowledging the shock on Amelia's face. He found the small jamming device tucked behind a junction box exactly where he expected it to be and disabled it with 2 quick motions, restoring a faint trickle of signal to the hallway. He told her, in a tone that was almost gentle despite everything that had just happened, not to use her company phone to call for help, explaining that anything routed through the building's main system could very likely be monitored by the same people who had arranged this ambush in the first place. From his jacket pocket he produced an older phone, the kind most people had stopped using years ago, and dialed a number that connected to a private line he had maintained since long before he ever set foot inside Carter Global. Amelia asked, finally finding her voice again, who exactly he was calling, and Mason answered only that it was someone who would help without asking questions that could not yet be safely answered. He did not offer his name as though it explained anything, and for the moment, watching three men groaning on the floor of a hallway that had nearly become her undoing, she did not push for more. A voice crackled through the building's overhead paging system before either of them could take another step, smooth and entirely too composed for someone who should have been alarmed by what had just happened to his men. It was Hunter Blake, speaking as though he were simply reading from a script he had rehearsed many times before. "Mason Reed," he said, "you really should have stayed invisible." Amelia turned to look at Mason, searching his face for some sign of surprise at hearing his own name spoken with such familiarity by a man she had trusted for years, and found instead only the same calm, unreadable expression he had worn since the moment he first stepped out of the shadows. Amelia pressed him for an answer as they moved away from the three men still recovering on the floor, asking plainly how a man she barely knew could be on a first-name basis with her head of security. Mason kept walking, scanning the stairwell ahead of them before answering, telling her only that this was not the moment for that conversation, and that getting her away from this floor mattered more than satisfying her curiosity. She wanted to argue, but something in the set of his jaw told her arguing would waste time neither of them had. They moved through a service stairwell rarely used by anyone above the maintenance staff, dim and narrow, the kind of space designed for function rather than comfort. Mason paused twice along the way, once to check a door that had been quietly wedged from the other side, and once to examine a thin wire run along the base of the wall that did not belong to any system he had installed or serviced himself. He said nothing about either discovery, simply adjusting their path slightly each time, the kind of quiet recalibration that suggested he had already mapped out several different routes before they had even reached this stairwell. Under the flickering emergency lighting, Amelia caught sight of an old scar along his wrist, pale and faded but unmistakably the mark of something far more serious than an accident with kitchen equipment. She noticed, too, the way his eyes moved constantly, never settling fully on her, always tracking the corners of the stairwell, the angles where someone might be waiting. It was the kind of awareness that could not be taught in a weekend course, the kind that came only from years spent somewhere far more dangerous than an office building. Mason had spent the better part of a decade working in protective operations for witnesses caught in the middle of major corporate corruption cases, the kind of work that rarely made headlines because success meant nobody ever found out it had happened at all. He had left that life behind after an assignment went wrong in a way that still occasionally surfaced in his memory at odd hours, a betrayal from within his own team that cost someone their life, and left him with a distrust of organizations that no apology could fully repair. He chose after that a quieter existence, one built around raising his daughter and staying as far from notice as possible. Amelia studied him as he spoke, piecing together a portrait entirely different from the maintenance worker she had passed in elevators without a second glance. This was not a man seeking recognition or thanks for what he had just done in that hallway. If anything, he seemed almost burdened by the attention, as though every moment spent standing out from the crowd cost him something he would rather not spend. She found herself believing, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that whatever he was about to tell her next would matter more than anything written in the files on that flash drive. Mason finally stopped at a landing where the stairwell opened toward a narrower corridor, leading back up toward the executive floors rather than down toward the lobby. He told her plainly that Hunter Blake was not working alone, that the voice on the radio earlier and the men who had just tried to stop her were only the visible edge of something larger, and that whoever stood behind it all had access reaching directly into her own executive suite. Amelia felt the last of her earlier disbelief give way to something colder and more urgent, the understanding that the danger she had walked into tonight was nowhere close to finished. Amelia's mind raced through the list of people who could possibly have that kind of access, and one name surfaced almost immediately, her own executive assistant, a young woman named Hannah who had handled her calendar for nearly 2 years with what had always seemed like complete loyalty. Mason told her gently that loyalty was not always the issue, that sometimes people were pressured rather than persuaded, threatened with something they could not afford to lose. He suspected, though he did not yet have proof, that Hannah had been forced to quietly share details of Amelia's schedule under circumstances neither of them could blame her for. The larger picture began forming as they spoke, fragments Mason had gathered over months of quiet observation, finally arranging themselves into something coherent. Connor Vale, a name Amelia recognized only vaguely from investor circles, had spent the better part of a year manufacturing doubt around her leadership, feeding selective rumors to board members about irregularities in company spending, rumors that conveniently lined up with the very irregularities she had noticed in the merger contract earlier that evening. The flash drive in her pocket was never meant to be the whole story, only the first piece. Bait designed to draw her attention away from the real evidence still sitting untouched on a server several floors above them. Mason suggested, to Amelia's visible surprise, that they go up rather than down, back toward the executive floors rather than away from the building entirely. She asked why anyone in their position would choose to move closer to danger instead of further from it, and his answer was simple and unsettling in its clarity. If she ran now, disappeared into the night without confronting what was happening, she would wake up by morning to headlines painting her as an executive who fled the building under suspicious circumstances, exactly the narrative Connor Vale needed to justify removing her from her own company. Staying meant risk. Running meant losing everything regardless of what was true. They used a narrow maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway, a route Mason clearly knew far better than anyone in his official job description should have reason to know. He guided her past a service door secured by an old electronic lock, working the panel with practiced fingers until it released with a soft click, the kind of small technical skill that, in this context, felt anything but small. Somewhere above them, Hunter's voice crackled briefly through the overhead system again, ordering the entire 41st floor sealed, a command meant to trap whoever was still moving through the building rather than protect anyone inside it. Mason barely reacted to the announcement, simply adjusting their path slightly and explaining, almost as an aside, that the building's backup power routing allowed certain doors to be overridden locally if you understood how the system had been wired during construction, a detail buried in blueprints most people never bothered reading. Amelia found herself trusting him more with every passing minute, not because he asked for her trust, but because every action he took seemed built entirely around her safety rather than his own advantage. It was a feeling she had not experienced in longer than she cared to admit, the sense of being protected by someone who wanted absolutely nothing from her in return. As they approached the heavy door leading into the executive suite, Mason held up a hand, signaling her to stop. Through the narrow reinforced window set into the door, both of them could see Connor Vale standing calmly near the main terminal. Speaking quietly with someone just out of view, his posture relaxed in the unmistakable way of a man who believed every piece of tonight's plan was still proceeding exactly as he had designed it. Connor Vale did not look like the architect of a hostile corporate ambush. He looked, instead, like the kind of investor who appeared on quiet financial broadcasts discussing diversified portfolios, silver-haired, perfectly composed, the sort of man whose voice never rose because he had learned long ago that calm always carried more authority than anger. When Amelia stepped through the door with Mason close behind her, Connor barely reacted, simply setting down the tablet in his hand and offering her a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. He told her almost kindly that she had always been too idealistic for a company this size, too attached to principles that looked admirable in interviews but cost shareholders money in practice. He explained that Carter Global needed someone willing to bow when pressure demanded it, someone who understood that survival sometimes required compromises she had never been willing to make. Beside him, Hunter Blake finally stepped fully into view, abandoning any pretense of loyalty, openly admitting that he had sold details of Amelia's schedule and movements to Connor for a price generous enough to make the decision easy. Connor gestured toward a camera positioned near the main terminal, explaining with chilling patience that he intended for Amelia to read a prepared statement of resignation on record before the night ended, framed carefully enough that the board would have no choice but to accept it as her own decision rather than anything forced. Amelia felt her stomach tighten, not from fear exactly, but from the particular fury of watching someone calmly plan to erase everything she had built, using nothing more than words and a camera lens. It was Mason who finally stepped forward, reaching into his jacket and placing 3 security access cards on the table in front of Connor, the cards belonging to Jason, Ryan, and Carter Miles. He said nothing as he did it, letting the small plastic rectangles speak entirely on their own. Connor's expression shifted for the first time that night, the calm cracking slightly as he understood that the men he had paid to remove any obstacles had failed completely. Undone by a maintenance worker nobody had bothered to consider a threat. Hunter moved first, grabbing a security baton from a nearby cabinet, lunging toward Mason with the kind of desperate aggression that comes from a man realizing his carefully built plan is collapsing in real time. Mason sidestepped the strike with minimal effort, redirecting Hunter's own momentum until his arm locked awkwardly behind his back, the baton clattering uselessly to the floor. He did not strike Hunter further than necessary, simply holding him in place, his focus calm and entirely controlled even as the room around him threatened to spiral into chaos. While the brief struggle unfolded, Amelia moved quickly and quietly toward the terminal, sliding the flash drive into a port and beginning a transfer of every file it contained directly to a secure backup, location only she and her legal team had access to, a safeguard she had built into the company's systems years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency. Mason, without being asked, kept the conversation with Connor going, asking pointed questions about the timeline of the merger and the names of other investors involved. Each question designed less to gather information and more to buy Amelia the handful of extra seconds she needed. Connor, sensing the shift but still confident in his position, allowed himself a slow, satisfied smile, the kind of expression worn by a man who believes he still holds one final card nobody else at the table has seen yet. He told them, almost casually, that the maintenance worker and the soon-to-be former chief executive should not get too comfortable, because a second and far more capable team was already on its way up to the 41st floor, summoned the moment his original plan had visibly begun to unravel. The sound of forced entry echoed from the side door moments later, heavy and deliberate, 4 men pushing through a panel they had pried loose from its frame rather than waiting for it to be unlocked properly. They moved with more urgency than the first 3 had shown, clearly briefed that their previous colleagues had failed and unwilling to repeat the same mistake. Mason turned toward the broken door with the same unhurried calm he had carried all night, looking at the twisted frame for a long moment before speaking. "Wrong door again," he said quietly, almost to himself. What none of the 4 men realized as they pushed through was that Mason had already shifted the building's emergency protocols into a localized lockdown mode while guiding Amelia through the maintenance corridor earlier, a function buried deep in the building's original construction blueprints that few people still working there even knew existed. The moment the last of the 4 men crossed the threshold, the heavy fire-rated door behind them slid shut and locked automatically, sealing the entire group inside the very space they had just forced their way into. Overhead lighting shifted into the building's emergency pattern, dimming most of the room while red strobes pulsed steadily near the exits, and a calm recorded voice announced a building-wide lockdown procedure now in effect. Reinforced glass barriers, designed originally for fire containment, lowered slowly along one side of the executive suite, cutting the room into smaller, more controllable sections. It was not brute force that handled the 4 newcomers, but architecture itself, turned deliberately against the very people who had hoped to use the building as a weapon. Amelia watched the scene unfold with something between awe and disbelief, understanding now the difference between the chaotic violence the 3 men in the hallway had attempted earlier and the controlled, almost surgical discipline Mason had just demonstrated instead. There was no wasted motion in anything he did, no anger driving his choices, only a clear and practiced understanding of how to neutralize danger while protecting everyone who did not deserve to be caught in the middle of it. While the 4 men pounded uselessly against the sealed door, Mason used his old phone again, this time reaching a contact from his years in federal protective work, someone still active enough in that world to dispatch a response team quietly and quickly, bypassing the slower routes that would have alerted Connor's allies before help could arrive. Connor, watching all of this unfold from across the room, finally allowed a flicker of genuine unease to cross his composed expression, the first real crack in a confidence that had carried him through months of careful planning. Amelia, finishing her data transfer at the terminal, turned the main screen toward the room and activated a live connection to the company's board members, several of whom had been gathered for an emergency virtual session organized hastily after rumors began circulating about irregularities in her conduct. With the press of a single key, everything she had just secured began streaming directly into that meeting, unfiltered and impossible to dismiss as rumor any longer. The board members, gathered across a dozen different screens in homes and offices across the country, fell silent as the files began appearing before them, financial records, recorded conversations, and time-stamped messages laying out in exact detail how Connor Vale had spent months manipulating stock movements, how he had quietly funneled payments to Hunter Blake, and how a coordinated effort had been made to intimidate and remove Amelia from the very company she had spent years building into something worth protecting. Hunter, still held firmly by Mason, attempted one last desperate move, raising his voice to claim that the real threat in the room was the maintenance worker standing beside Amelia, a man who, according to Hunter, had broken into restricted systems and orchestrated an unauthorized intrusion into company infrastructure. It was a clumsy accusation, made worse by the fact that Mason said nothing in his own defense, simply reaching into his jacket once more and producing an old identification card, faded but unmistakably authentic, issued years earlier by a federal agency that had once relied on him for sensitive protective assignments. One of the older board members, a woman who had served on similar oversight committees for decades, recognized the card immediately and went pale, recalling a case years earlier where an anonymous federal contractor had quietly helped unravel an extortion scheme threatening another major company, a case that had never been publicly detailed but had circulated quietly within certain corporate security circles for years afterward. She said his name slowly, almost to herself, finally understanding exactly who had been standing in plain sight inside Carter Global all along. Amelia, steadied now by the unmistakable weight of evidence behind her, addressed the board directly, her voice no longer shaking with uncertainty but carrying the same confidence that had built her career in the first place. She formally requested an immediate freeze on all of Connor Vale's access to company systems and financial accounts, a motion the board approved within moments. The kind of decision that would have taken weeks under ordinary circumstances, but now required only seconds given everything they had just witnessed unfold in real time. Connor, realizing the position he had built so carefully had collapsed entirely, attempted to slip toward a side exit while attention remained fixed on the screen, only to find federal agents already moving through the corridor outside, summoned earlier by the very phone call Mason had made while the four men pounded uselessly against the sealed door. He was taken into custody without resistance, his composed expression finally giving way to something far less controlled as reality settled over him. Mason released Hunter into the custody of the arriving agents and stepped back from the center of the room entirely, retreating toward the quiet edge near the window the way he always seemed to gravitate toward open space rather than attention. He wanted no part of the explanations that followed, no credit for what had just happened, content simply to watch as order slowly returned to a room that had nearly become the site of Amelia's downfall. Amelia, watching him retreat from the spotlight without a word, found herself with a single question she could no longer hold back. Once the agents had finished their initial work and the room had quieted considerably, Amelia crossed to where Mason stood near the window and asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the moment he first stepped out of the shadows in that back hallway. She wanted to know why a man with his background, his training, his clear capability had spent 6 months quietly fixing light fixtures and stuck doors in her building instead of doing anything else with that life. Mason answered slowly, choosing his words with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. He told her he had not come to Carter Global for the salary, modest as it was for someone with his particular skill set, but because he had noticed, through old contacts who still occasionally reached out to him, that her company had drawn the attention of a network disturbingly similar to the one that had once betrayed his own team years earlier. He had no solid proof at the time, nothing he could have brought forward without risking being dismissed entirely, so he chose instead to become part of the building itself, watching quietly from a position nobody would think to question. Amelia thought back over the past 6 months, small inconveniences she had barely registered, an elevator that malfunctioned at a convenient moment, a stuck door that delayed a meeting just long enough to avoid an uncomfortable encounter, a faulty camera that always seemed to fail in places where it mattered least. She understood now that none of it had been coincidence at all, that a quiet man with a toolbox had been steadily working behind the scenes to keep disaster at bay long before tonight ever forced his hand into the open. Mason admitted with something close to weariness in his voice that he wanted nothing more than for this to be finished, for the threat to be fully removed so he could return to the simple, unremarkable life he had built for himself and his daughter, far from headlines and far from any spotlight that came with being recognized for what he had done. Amelia asked gently whether he had ever once considered that she might be worth protecting for her own sake rather than simply as part of a larger threat he happened to be tracking. He considered the question longer than she expected before answering honestly that he had noticed something about her early on, the fact that during a difficult round of budget cuts the previous year, she had personally fought to ensure every lower-level employee kept their full pay even as other executives quietly trimmed those same wages to protect their own bonuses. It was a small detail, easy to overlook, but it had told him more about her character than any boardroom presentation ever could. For the first time that night, Amelia looked at Mason Reed not as a maintenance worker who happened to know how to fight, but as someone who had been quietly holding up the entire building, in more ways than one, long before she ever knew his name. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened inside Carter Global moved quietly through legal proceedings rather than headlines, exactly the way Mason preferred it. Connor Vale faced charges related to securities manipulation and conspiracy, his carefully built network of influence unraveling piece by piece as investigators worked through the evidence Amelia had secured that night. Hunter Blake cooperated fully once it became clear that loyalty to Connor would offer him nothing but a longer sentence, providing details that helped close several remaining gaps in the case. The board, shaken by how close the company had come to losing its chief executive through manufactured scandal, voted unanimously to restore Amelia's full authority and issued a public statement praising her handling of the crisis without revealing the more dramatic details of that single rain-soaked night. Amelia used the moment to push through changes she had wanted to make for some time, increasing the security budget allocated to protecting lower-level employees and introducing stronger protections against the kind of internal manipulation that had nearly cost her everything. She approached Mason a week later with an offer to lead a newly created strategic security division, a role with real authority, real resources, and a title that would have finally given him the recognition his old career had never allowed. Mason hesitated, the offer sitting uneasily alongside the quiet, anonymous life he had carefully built for himself and his daughter over the past several years. He had spent a long time trying to disappear from rooms exactly like the one she was now inviting him permanently into. Amelia, sensing his reluctance, did not push the way another executive might have. She told him simply that her company needed people who could not be bought, people who understood that protecting something well sometimes mattered more than being seen doing it, and that she was not interested in turning him into a headline or a public symbol of anything. She wanted more than recognition, someone she could trust completely, and she suspected he already understood that better than anyone she could hire from outside. Mason eventually agreed, on the condition that there would be no press attention, no public statements naming him, no attempt to turn what had happened into a story the world would consume and quickly forget. Amelia agreed without hesitation, understanding instinctively that pushing him into the spotlight would have cost her the very thing that made him valuable in the first place, his ability to remain quietly, reliably unseen until the moment he was needed most. That same evening, as the two of them finished the conversation near the same window, where everything had nearly fallen apart days earlier, his phone buzzed once with a short message from his daughter, asking simply whether he would be home in time for dinner. Mason smiled faintly, told her he would be there soon, and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket without further remark, the small ordinary moment grounding him after a week that had been anything but ordinary. Amelia watched him gather his old toolbox one final time before heading toward the elevator, noting, not for the first time, that the strongest people in any room were rarely the ones who spoke the loudest or demanded the most attention. Mason left the building just as dawn began breaking over the city, his faded work jacket still draped over his shoulders, indistinguishable from any other tired worker heading home after a long shift. Amelia stood behind the glass doors of the lobby and watched him go, understanding that she had not only saved her company that night, but had quietly gained an ally that no amount of money or influence would ever be able to buy away from her again. She thought, as the elevator doors closed behind him, of every quiet person she had ever underestimated in her career, every assistant, every technician, every unnoticed face moving through the background of important rooms. Carter Global would carry on, stronger and more careful than before, but Amelia carried with her a different kind of certainty now, one that had nothing to do with contracts or mergers. The next time someone tried to block her path through any door in that building, they would be choosing, without realizing it, to test exactly the wrong person standing quietly nearby. If this story convinced you that the quietest person in the room can sometimes be the most dangerous one for anyone with bad intentions, share your thoughts below and stay close for the next story.